is racism?
It is not a fact, an inherent fact of human existence. It is a creation of human civilization. It is the denial of others' humanity, ultimately. It is the creation of this hierarchy of less than, of, and the terminology that has been used by regimes, nations throughout history, run the gamut from, I mean, sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's what we call dog whistling, but sometimes it's just out and out, explicitly racist. Animals, savage, less than human.
Good! What's that sound? George Floyd! What's he say? I can't breathe! I can't breathe!
I think sadly, we've been reacquainted with some of the language in recent years that has been familiar to historians who've looked at regimes from Nazi Germany to Imperial Japan to, the Balkans. I mean, there are nations that have warred against their own peoples for reasons ultimately having to do with racism. It's been, sadly, tragically, a history of racially fueled genocide, sometimes in the very worst instances, in the case most horrifically of the Germans and the Nazi regime and others. But that's a very long answer to a complicated question. It is ultimately the creation by folks of white skin, Caucasian peoples, of a class of other peoples, brown, black folk, communities of color, often immigrants, native peoples who are classified, categorized as less than fully human, less than entitled to the full responsibilities and rights of American citizenship. That's the sad, tragic history of American racism in a nutshell.
And I'm glad you brought up, it goes beyond just African Americans. Like you said, it affects immigrants too, because I know a lot of people automatically jump to, African Americans, but I'm glad you brought up that it goes beyond that, because most people don't think about that.
I mean, we think a lot about COVID these days, right? And the disproportionate impacts being felt in communities of color by COVID-19 are an expression of systemic structural racism, from healthcare availability, accessibility to healthcare, to who we classify as essential workers, who has to go out and work in the slaughterhouses to butcher the meat that we all eat, and in doing so, making themselves and their families more vulnerable to the coronavirus. I mean, there's all kinds of ways this is playing out, right? But the numbers tell a pretty damning story. 171 out of 100,000 Black Americans, and this is adjusted for age. So across the different racial categories, right, adjusted for age, the hospitalization rates for Black Americans are 171 per 100,000, right? For Native Americans, it's 193, even a little bit higher. For Latinx peoples, it's 150 per 100,000. So think about that, 150, 171, 193, really relatively high numbers of hospitalization, right? For white Americans, it's 37 out of 100,000. So, that is a manifestation, that is an expression of, again, the racially cast ways in which COVID-19 is being felt in this society, not only by African Americans, but as you say, by other communities of color. It's expressed in all kinds of ways that are kind of deeply baked into healthcare, to the social and economic inequities that long predate COVID, right? That go back to, ultimately to slavery in the case of African Americans, and how wealth is accumulated, and, who gets to sit on their couch like I do as a white privileged male and make a living being an educator, who made it into graduate school, ultimately because of my background and my white skin in part, right? And the challenges that are faced by young Black and brown men in the society, and to some extent Asian and Native American, certainly, to make it upwardly mobile, to make it in this society, and who have the capacity by the nature of their work to be safe and secure as the pandemic rages and other communities of color are exposed much more severely to this plague. Of course, there's policing, right, and the criminal justice system, and I mean, it's hardly a day goes by, right? It seems. I mean, here we are just yesterday, Mr. Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, the latest victim, and I mean, it's like 60% of Black Americans in this country feel less secure at the sight of a policeman. And that figure for white Americans is something like 22% of us feel less secure at the sight of a cop. We should feel, all of us, more secure at the sight of those who are supposed to be guardians of, right, our communities and law and order. The deep history of systemic racism felt in police and criminal justice system. And again, some of that goes back to the days of slave catching, to right, those who were paid basically bounties, right, to go after human beings, enslaved persons who were trying to escape to their freedom. I mean, that's some of the important origins of policing, and that, flows right through our history into the late 19th and 20th century on to the present moment, when Black Americans are often afraid, when there's a domestic disturbance or some kind of an altercation in their own neighborhood, they're afraid to call the cops because they don't know if the cop is going to make the situation safer and calm things down, or quite often exacerbate the situation, and it's going to end in some kind of violent altercation and potentially death. The conversations that I never had to have with my son when he went out at night, on a date in high school, or when he went off to college, and I didn't have to tell him, my wife and I, what Black parents have to have, those conversations with their young men, especially, and young women, going out into the world, what to do, what not to do, when you're driving through whatever kind of neighborhood. I mean, those are the conversations that most of us who, are privileged to wear white skin in America don't often, or haven't traditionally, thought enough about until I think this moment, really of racial reckoning. And we're now having conversations like this with ourselves and educating ourselves to a much greater degree than anything I've seen in my lifetime. And that includes the 60s. I'm old enough to have lived through the turbulence of the 60s. I was a boy then, but we never really had the kind of serious, sobering, we white Americans never really had the kind of serious discussion about the historic, systemic, structural roots of the racism that still lives and breathes among us, that we're having now. So this is encouraging. What's happening right now is absolutely an encouraging moment.
No, there's no fraternity on here.
I think, again, for the first time, white Americans are able to acknowledge, in fact, it's the figure I saw sometime in the last week. I think it was a Pew poll indicated that 62%, I think was the figure, 63% of Americans, and that's inclusive of all races, now know it, that understand that Black and brown Americans face systemic racism. That is an all-time high. Like I remember, I mean, for most of my adult life, most of my life, it's been the case that, and this is, you know, it's not true for every white American, certainly, but more times than not, when, you know, you have a conversation, and I've seen this on occasion in my own classes, you know, you start talking about racism and race, and white students usually, they'll get uncomfortable and kind of look down, you know, and don't really want to talk about it. It's very uncomfortable, and don't really want to acknowledge, well, my parents, I didn't own slaves and my parents didn't either. I think that is changing. I think, you know, slowly, incrementally, there had been some kind of opening to understanding that, yes, we now living, you know, in America didn't own slaves, but we are the beneficiaries of a society, and the institutions, the political and the economic and the cultural institutions that are very much part of our life now in our society, and from which we have benefited, were built upon the backs of Black and brown bodies. And the wealth disparity that we see across American society, the great disparities in home ownership, the inability, again, of so many Black, hardworking Black and brown family members to crawl out of poverty, the disparity in wages, and on and on. Like those realities now, we are finally having those kinds of conversations in this country, have made it so that people don't flinch. I think, I mean, I've seen it just in the few conversations I've had over the last few months, you know, in this Zoom world we're in now. You don't have the same kind of automatic reactionary, oh no, that's not me, I don't want to talk about it. I think there is now a greater willingness to admit that the America of 2020 is in fact a result of, you know, ultimately 401 years of systemic structural racism. And so it's a more honest discussion I think we're having now. Not that we're going to have any overnight solutions. There's not going to be, you know, a transformation overnight. There are a lot of resistance forces working in the other direction. White supremacy has been given license in a much more terrifying way than anything I've seen, again, since I was a kid, when the Ku Klux Klan ran amok in the swamps of Mississippi. I mean, we're seeing it now in ways that are really frightening, that coming from the other direction, the direction of darkness. So we have a lot of work to do, well, and miles and miles to go, but at least now I think there is an opening in the culture to have more honest conversations. I mean, you can see it even in the kinds of films that Americans have been watching on Netflix as we've been home, you know, for these last 6 months. People want to know more. They want to understand more about the history of racist institutions, political and economic, that have created the society in which we are now living. So those are all positive indicators. And the way we react, I think, to the term racism now and to a racist society really is changing in important ways.
So is there anything else that you wanted to say about the subject?
I don't think so. I had been thinking about a story, so a quick story that I heard from one of our interviewees when we did the African American Heritage Trail project. We did the oral history interviews, and this is available on our website, sharedheritage.org. People can listen to the whole interview of Ms. Davis, Celestine Bell Davis, who's 91 now. And she told the story of how she and a white woman, a Jewish woman, really kind of an iconic figure in parts of the Erie community for many years, Kate Busick. She was a board member of the NAACP. I think her family, you know, survivors of the Holocaust, and she was a champion of civil and human rights. And she and Celeste, who's a Black woman, they went into a local restaurant that I will not name in Erie, although it is in the interview. Beloved favorite breakfast spot in Erie. This is back in like the early 60s, right? And they were trying to raise the issue of discrimination and discriminatory treatment received by Black Americans in restaurants, among other retail establishments. And so Celeste and her husband go into the restaurant and they sit down and they wait for service, and they wait and they wait and they wait. And then Kate Busick and her husband come in a little while later, 10, 20 minutes, I don't know, 10 minutes later, something like that. And immediately she's served, right? I mean, could have been a mistake, but this particular restaurant had been notable in the Black community for its discriminatory treatment like that. And then when they got the bill, they had ordered the same thing, and Celeste was charged more than Kate Busick. You know, I mean, that sort of thing. I mean, that is systemic racism. That, you know, that's old fashioned, you know, old style racism. And sadly, I mean, you asked about how it's changed, you know, and things have changed for the better in many respects, but that sort of thing, you know, I suspect still happens, you know, and we know that Black families, you know, are still denied loans to go buy a home in a particular neighborhood. Redlining, which was a fact of life in the housing industry across this country and was sanctioned by the federal government, by the FHA, and by banks and real estate companies. I mean, that's why, you know, a big reason anyhow, why Black families are unable to pass on wealth to the next generation, right? Because home ownership is a really vital, important source of wealth, generationally speaking. And here's one last statistic I will offer you. In 1968, 40.9% of African Americans owned a home in America. So a little less than half. In 2020, the figure is 40.6%. It's actually dropped by 0.3%. And this is, you know, 1968 was the year they passed the Fair Housing Act to make it, you know, illegal for banks and the FHA and so on to discriminate against Black Americans. So even now, and again, that goes to the deep-seated inequities across the society in wages, income, salary, opportunities for Black versus brown, Black and brown versus white Americans. So, you know, discrimination, it's not quite what it was in the early 1960s, but it's still a thing, and it still is very much expressed in ways that most of us, again, who have white privilege are not able to recognize, because we don't have to live with it, you know. But fortunately, we are now at least having a more honest national conversation. And I appreciate this conversation with you.
Yeah, I appreciate it too, because it's, you know, it's good to know that like people are noticing it. And it's like you said, we still have work to do. Like just the examples that you gave me goes to show that we still have work to do. And, you know, I don't think the issue will ever be, you know, completely dead, but, you know, there's ways that it can be, I guess, fixed and, you know, like I said, more talked about, like what we're doing right now.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it's empathy, right? And we have a serious empathy deficit in America. The ability to see ourselves in the shoes of others, right? And to put ourselves, to have understanding of what it would be like, what it must be like to be the other, to be a Black or brown person walking around in the world, you know, in America in 2020, right? We have to be able to do that. Otherwise, you know, the world envisioned by John Lewis and Dr. King, you know, will never come to pass. So it's ultimately, for me, it's about human understanding and empathy.
Definitely, for sure. Well, again, I really appreciate this. Thank you so much. Like you gave me a lot of great information on, you know, the educational side. I appreciate all the statistics and, you know, all the stories that you've given me. So this will definitely be something important to put out to everybody.
Sounds good, Odessa. Thank you for the opportunity. It was nice to talk with you. Nice to meet you. I'll
Of
be at
course, nice to
Zoom
meet
style.
you.
All right. Take
Have
care.
a great day.